There are truths that arrive like storms, loud, violent, impossible to ignore. And then there are truths that arrive like a quiet shadow at the edge of the room, patient enough to wait until no one remembers when it first appeared. The latter are always more dangerous. They do not demand attention. They earn it slowly, slipping into conversations, into glances, into the fragile spaces between what people say and what they refuse to admit. And when they finally step forward into the light, they do not simply disrupt reality. They rewrite it. That was how Remy Pryce entered the life of Brooke Logan. Not with chaos, with certainty. The moment he walked into the orbit of the Logan family, something shifted, not outwardly at first, not in ways that could be easily explained or even articulated, but in a deeper, more instinctive layer of awareness that Brooke had learned over years of navigating power and consequence. Never to ignore. It was not fear that touched her first. It was recognition without memory, the unsettling sense that something from a part of her past she had deliberately sealed away had found its way back, reshaped, rearmed, and no longer willing to remain silent. Remy did not introduce himself as a stranger. He introduced himself as a missing piece. And missing pieces, when returned at the wrong time, rarely restore anything. They expose what was broken before anyone realized it. At first, his presence could have been dismissed as coincidence. Los Angeles, after all, had a way of folding lives into each other in unexpected patterns. But Remy did not behave like someone who had stumbled into proximity. He behaved like someone who had arrived at a destination he had already studied in detail. His attention was precise. His observations were selective. And most unsettling of all, his familiarity with Brooke's past was not general. It was specific. Too specific. The first time he spoke her name in that quiet, deliberate tone, Brooke felt something inside her tighten. Not visibly, not in a way anyone else in the room could have detected, but enough to disrupt the internal balance she had spent years constructing. Because the way he said, it was not the way strangers speak. It was the way history speaks when it has returned with intention. Brooke Logan, he said, as if the name itself carried weight beyond identity. I've been looking forward to this. The words were not threatening on the surface, but beneath them was something unmistakable. Expectation. And Brooke, who had spent years mastering the art of controlling narrative, of shaping perception before it could shape her, found herself, for the first time in a long while, without immediate control of the direction the conversation would take. Remy did not rush. That was his advantage. He understood that power is not asserted in the first moment. It is established in the second, when the other person begins to realize they are no longer dictating the terms of engagement. He let the silence expand, and in that silence, Brooke's mind moved faster than her expression ever would. She began to search, memories, decisions, moments that might connect this man to something she had buried. But the past she had constructed for herself was not incomplete. It was curated, and curated histories are always vulnerable to disruption by those who know where the omissions are. When Remy finally spoke again, he did not offer explanation. He offered revelation. Not all at once. Not fully. Just enough. He told her who he was. Not in terms of present identity, but in terms of origin. A son. A lost connection. A name tied to a figure Brooke had not spoken of in years. Not publicly, not privately, not even to herself in ways that would allow the memory to take form. A man who had once held power, influence, and secrets. A man whose absence had been more convenient than his presence would ever have been. And Remy, standing in front of her now, was not simply claiming connection. He was proving it. The evidence he carried was not theatrical. It was methodical. Documents, records, fragments of history that, when assembled, formed a structure Brooke could not easily dismantle. But it was not his identity that truly destabilized her. It was what he knew, because identity can be questioned. Knowledge cannot. The business deal, the one she had never spoken of, the one that had existed not as a mistake, but as a necessity, a decision made in a moment where every option carried consequence, and she had chosen the one that preserved her family at the cost of something she had convinced herself would remain hidden. Illegal, untraceable, or so she had believed. Years had passed. Time had done what time always does. It had softened edges, blurred details, allowed memory to reshape itself into something less threatening. Brooke had built a life beyond that moment, layered new truths over old compromises until the original act felt distant enough to exist without immediate consequence. But time does not erase. It conceals. And Remy had uncovered what time had hidden. He did not accuse her. He did not confront her. He simply presented the existence of the information as fact. And then, quietly, he explained what he intended to do with it. Blackmail is rarely about money alone. It is about position. Remy did not want compensation. He wanted access, a place within the structure that had once excluded him, a role within the company that represented everything his past had been denied. He wanted legitimacy, but not through recognition, through leverage. Brooke listened without interrupting because she understood something critical. Reaction is the first form of surrender in negotiations where information imbalance exists. If she reacted emotionally, she would confirm vulnerability. If she denied too quickly, she would reveal uncertainty. So she remained still. But inside, everything was moving. Because this was not just about her. It was about everything connected to her. Her family, her reputation, her marriage. Ridge. The thought of Ridge did not arrive gently. It came with weight. Because their relationship had already survived fractures, betrayals, reconciliations that had required more than forgiveness. They had required reconstruction of trust. And trust, once rebuilt, is never as resilient as it was before it was broken. This secret, if exposed, would not simply damage trust. It would redefine it. Remy understood that. Of course he did. That was why he had chosen this moment. Because timing is everything in the execution of leverage. And Brooke, despite everything she had survived, despite every crisis she had navigated, understood that she was no longer in control of the timeline. Remy set his terms clearly. A position within the company. Not symbolic. Operational. Influential. He wanted authority, not proximity. And he wanted it granted without resistance. Because resistance would trigger exposure. The implication did not need to be spoken. It existed in the space between what he said and what he did not say. Brooke did not agree immediately. She could not. Not because she did not understand the stakes, but because agreement itself would set into motion consequences she could not yet fully predict. Allowing Remy into the company meant introducing instability into a system already strained by internal conflicts. It meant placing someone with unknown long-term intentions into a position of influence. But refusing him meant risking something even greater. Exposure. And exposure, in her world, was not just about truth. It was about interpretation. Because the story of what she had done years ago would not be told in context. It would be told in fragments. Stripped of motivation. Reframed as greed, manipulation, deception. The nuance would disappear. The consequences would not. When she finally spoke, her voice did not betray what she was thinking. Years of experience had taught her that control of tone is control of perception. "You're asking for something that doesn't belong to you," she said carefully. Remy did not smile, but something in his expression shifted. Not satisfaction, recognition, because he had expected resistance. "I'm asking for something that should have been mine a long time ago," he replied. And there it was. Not just ambition, resentment. A narrative of loss that had shaped his identity long before he ever stepped into Brooke's world. This was not simply a calculated move. It was personal, and personal motivations are always more unpredictable than strategic ones. Brooke left that conversation without resolution. But resolution was no longer the immediate concern. Containment was. Because now she carried something she could not share without consequence. A secret that had reawakened. A threat that had embedded itself into her present. And a choice that would define not only her future, but the future of everyone connected to her. Ridge noticed a change in her before she spoke a word about it. He always did. It was not in her behavior, not overtly. It was in the spaces between her words, the slight delay before responses, the way her focus seemed to shift even when she was physically present. These were not dramatic changes. But Ridge had learned, over years of loving Brooke Logan, that the smallest shifts often signaled the deepest fractures. When he asked her what was wrong, she did what she had always done in moments where truth felt too dangerous. She deflected, not entirely, just enough. And in doing so, she created the very distance she feared. Because silence, when placed between two people who rely on trust, does not remain neutral. It becomes a presence of its own. Meanwhile, Remy Pryce did not wait. He moved forward, positioning himself not as an outsider requesting entry, but as someone already operating within the system. He began making connections, observing internal dynamics, identifying pressure points within the company structure. He did not need formal authority yet. He was building informal influence. And that was far more dangerous, because informal influence grows unnoticed until it is too integrated to remove without disruption. Brooke, watching this unfold, realized that time was no longer an asset. It was a liability. Every moment she delayed action increased Remy's presence. Every moment she remained silent increased the risk of exposure. And every moment she tried to maintain normalcy in her marriage increased the distance between her and Ridge. The life she had built was not collapsing. Not yet, but it was shifting, and shifts, when ignored, become fractures. The question she now faced was not whether she could stop Remy. It was whether she could survive the truth if she tried. The illusion of control never shatters all at once. It fractures in layers, thin, almost invisible cracks spreading beneath the surface until the structure that once felt immovable begins to shift under its own weight. Brooke Logan had spent years mastering the art of maintaining that illusion, shaping reality through poise, timing, and silence when necessary. But what Remy Pryce had introduced into her world was not a crisis she could manage with elegance. It was a slow, unraveling, deliberate, and patient, designed not to destroy her instantly, but to make her participate in her own undoing. In the days that followed their encounter, Brooke found herself living in two parallel realities. In one, she remained the composed figure everyone expected her to be, present beside Ridge, attentive within the family, unwavering in public. In the other, she was calculating constantly, tracing the edges of a past she had buried, measuring every word she spoke against the risk that it might collide with what Remy already knew. That second reality grew louder with each passing hour, because Remy was not waiting. He was integrating. His presence within the company began as something subtle enough to dismiss. A conversation here, a suggestion there, a quiet familiarity with internal processes that no outsider should have possessed. He did not demand authority immediately. He allowed the structure to bend around him first, inserting himself into spaces where influence could grow without formal recognition. And that was what made him dangerous. He understood that power, once formally granted, can be challenged. But power that emerges organically, through perception, through perceived competence, through quiet alignment with existing tensions, is far harder to remove without destabilizing everything around it. Brooke saw it happening. She recognized the pattern with a clarity that only someone who had once manipulated systems herself could fully grasp. And yet, for all her awareness, she found herself paralyzed, not by fear of Remy alone, but by the magnitude of what exposing him would cost. Because exposing Remy meant exposing herself. And the past she had buried was not something that could survive public scrutiny without consequence. Ridge, meanwhile, was no longer content with silence. He had watched Brooke long enough to know that her deflections were not casual. They were deliberate, and deliberation meant concealment. The distance between them had grown, not dramatically, not in ways that would alarm anyone else, but enough for him to feel the absence of something that had once defined their connection. Trust was not gone, but it was no longer complete. One evening, When the quiet between them had stretched too far to ignore, Ridge finally confronted her, not with accusation, but with something more difficult to navigate. Concern. "Something's wrong," he said simply, his voice steady but searching. "And you're not letting me in?" Brooke met his gaze, and for a moment, just a moment, the weight of everything she was carrying pressed dangerously close to the surface. She could tell him. She could end the isolation, share the burden, allow the truth to exist between them rather than inside her alone. But truth, once spoken, does not remain contained. It spreads. And what she feared was not just Ridge's reaction. It was what would follow. So she chose restraint. "I'm fine," she said, the words controlled, practiced, insufficient. Ridge did not argue, but he did not believe her. And belief, once fractured, does not repair itself without effort. The distance between them did not explode into conflict. It settled into something quieter, more dangerous, because silence leaves room for interpretation. And interpretation rarely favors trust. Remy, observing from the edges, understood exactly what was happening. He had not only inserted himself into the corporate structure, he had inserted himself into the emotional architecture of Brooke's life. Every moment she withheld truth from Ridge strengthened his position. Every hesitation, every deflection, every carefully avoided conversation deepened the fracture he intended to widen. He did not need to force exposure. He only needed to let pressure build. Meanwhile, beyond the Logan family, the ripple effects of his presence began to intersect with other tensions already destabilizing the system. The fragile alliance forming between Will Spencer and R.J. Forrester had begun to take shape in ways neither Bill nor Ridge had fully recognized. What had started as quiet resistance was evolving into something more coordinated, more intentional. And Remy noticed. Of course he did, because instability creates opportunity. He began to study them, not directly, not in ways that would reveal his interest, but through observation, through patterns, through the subtle shifts in behavior that signaled alignment. Two men who had once defined themselves in opposition were now moving with a shared purpose. That alone was enough to matter. But what interested Remy more was not their alliance. It was how that alliance could be used. Because every system under pressure eventually produces fractures. And fractures, when properly exploited, do not just weaken structures. They redirect them. Brooke, still caught between silence and exposure, began to realize that waiting was no longer a viable strategy. Remy's influence was expanding too quickly. The longer she delayed, the more embedded he became, not just within the company, but within the narrative itself. He was no longer an outsider demanding entry. He was becoming part of the story. And once someone becomes part of the story, removing them requires rewriting everything. That realization forced her into motion. Not openly, not recklessly, but deliberately. She began to investigate him. Not the identity he had presented, but the gaps within it. Because every constructed narrative contains inconsistencies, and Brooke had built enough narratives in her own life to know where to look for them. If Remy had uncovered her past, then he had done so through means that could, in turn, be traced. And if they could be traced, they could be challenged. But what she discovered did not bring relief. It brought complication. Remy's connection to her past was real, but it was not complete. There were missing pieces, and those missing pieces suggested something far more unsettling. That Remy was not acting alone. That someone else had helped him, guided him, perhaps even sent him. The implication shifted everything, because now this was no longer a singular threat. It was a network, and networks are far more difficult to dismantle than individuals. Ridge, sensing the change in Brooke again, this time not as distance, but as movement, began to push more directly. He asked questions she could not easily deflect. He looked for answers in places she had not yet secured. And with each step he took closer to the truth, Brooke felt the fragile balance she had been maintaining begin to tilt. She was running out of time. Remy, aware of that, made his next move. He did not confront her again. He did not escalate openly. Instead, he positioned himself where exposure would no longer be a threat he needed to use. Because if he could make himself indispensable, the risk of removing him would outweigh the risk of keeping him. And that was the most dangerous position of all, to become a liability that cannot be eliminated. Brooke stood at the edge of a decision she could no longer postpone. Silence had protected her for years. It had allowed her to rebuild, to move forward, to construct a life that felt stable enough to trust. But now silence was no longer protection. It was vulnerability, and the truth she had feared revealing was no longer something she could contain alone. Because Remy Pryce had not come to destroy her life in a single moment. He had come to reshape it, piece by piece, until the version of reality she had built could no longer exist without him inside it. And the question that now defined everything was not whether Brooke would act. It was whether she would act before the story she had been trying to